We have an exciting panel and an exciting conversation coming up over the next 40 minutes. Green finance, the climate crisis, it affects all of us. And whether we are in the public sector, the private sector, nonprofits, NGOs, whatever work we do is increasingly tied to both climate and, in a way, climate finance. At least that's what I'm finding with my work as well. And Asia and Africa are really ground zero for an effective response. And models piloted in these various regions are the real solution to achieving climate targets and a successful green transition. That also means multiple actors with multiple agendas and differing approaches. And I think during this panel, we're going to try to address some of the major questions in investing in our green future. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panel. Right next to me, we have Christopher Ogunmodede, who is the Associate Editor of World Politics Review. Next to him, we have Francesc Pont, who is a Senior Advisor and G20 Coordinator in the Office of the Spanish Prime Minister. Welcome. We have Edward Claassen, who is the head of the Regional Hub for East Africa as part of the European Investment Bank. Welcome to you. And then last but not least, we have Valentina Balesi, who is a Policy Analyst at the OECD. Welcome. And thanks to all of you for being with us today. So Christopher, I'd like to start with you. I think what we want to do for this conversation is sort of start broad if we can, and then narrow it down as we get into the conversation and before we get to audience questions. So I want you to give us a sense of the current macroeconomic environment that we're in and what it means for green finance. We have to take into account ongoing recessions and potential incoming recessions, debt crises, emerging de-globalisation. So give us a sense of the general picture, the general broad macroeconomic picture of green finance at the moment. What are you looking at?
Yeah. So when you think of how to accelerate financing for the just transition and the green agenda, it's always important to start from a place of sort of tension in the macroeconomic environment globally. So a couple weeks ago, the IMF put out its annual World Economic Outlook, where it projected that in the medium term, for the next couple of years, it's going to be one of slowed growth in the majority of the world, including, of course, the global south. There will be some outliers in the US and Europe, but even there, it's going to be sort of uneven macroeconomic productivity and outlook. So that's the big picture in terms of the large-scale economies, for sure, in the European Union, in the United States, and in China, but also the rest of the world, India and the African countries and Latin America. So that's obviously where everything begins. How will economic productivity affect the ability to allocate funding for domestic as well as international priorities? And then, of course, there's the geopolitical environment. You have what many people refer to as de-globalisation, where, decoupling in China, but the increasing pressure by the US to get its European allies to also join its decoupling efforts from China. You also have friendshoring, where lots of countries are moving their strategic assets, including global value chains, to more friendly countries. That also has impact on macroeconomic stability and trade and commerce. You also have the increased, there's a term a lot of people in political science called weaponized interdependence, how the financial system is being weaponized by powerful states, including but not solely the United States, to essentially put pressure on other actors around the world. Of course, we see that with Russia and the context of the Ukraine war, but we also see it with China. Last year, the US Commerce Department put restrictions on China's industries. All of these things will affect the financial industry. It would affect technology. It will affect other sectors of the economy. It will affect industrial productivity. It will also sort of spur a race to the bottom in terms of other countries pursuing more protectionist activities, because everyone wants to protect its own bottom line. The US has had its Inflation Reduction Act. The EU has sort of followed up with its own agenda. You've had the EU's climate agenda, which the US itself complained about, and many other states in the global south have complained about. So there are all of these things going on. You have, of course, the Global Climate Fund, which many countries in the global south regard as insufficient to meet the challenges. Some estimates say that developing countries would need about $2.4 trillion to meet their own just transition needs. That's a whole lot of money for countries that are struggling financially to begin with. Countries that have been, racked by the global pandemic, and of course the effects of the Ukraine war, and of course the inflationary effects of the US Federal Reserve rate hikes. All of these things increase their borrowing cost, which has a downward spiral effect on the economy. So this is the big picture when you think of green financing, which is an inherently political decision. And it's a very political debate because, global South countries insist that, look, we've got these fossil fuels, we've got these sectors of our economy that we depend on. We can't just have a transition swiftly without a stopgap, without an ability to backstop this transition. How do we grow our economies? To get that just transition, we need to prepare ourselves industrially, socially, economically, and otherwise. It's not going to happen overnight, so we need to fund these things. But how do we get there? But of course, the wealthier countries of the global north are insisting, well, the world is falling apart, so we need to get going right now. These are political debates. But for countries, let's say if you're in Pakistan, if you're in Nigeria, where you've had floods, Mozambique, South Africa, these aren't debates. These are life and death issues. So that's the big picture. Finance ministers, central bankers, corporations, multilateral development banks, international organizations. This is the big picture they all look at as they think of green finance.
So there's a lot there, and thank you for that. That was really comprehensive. So Francesca, I want to turn to you and maybe have you pick up on a thread there, this thread of multilateralism. You do a lot of work on the G20, obviously. That's one of your roles in the office of the Spanish Prime Minister. And you've been involved with a lot of the ongoing efforts within the G20 and beyond that. So we have the Summit for a New Global Financing Pact that's happening this month. We have the SDG Summit right after the G20 Delhi Summit, and we're also looking at the COP28 in November. Can we expect things? Can we expect actual developments at these various meetings that you are looking very closely at over the next few months?
Yes, I would say the answer for now is yes and no. I'll start with the good news. As you name it, there's a sequence of events, of summits that are leading us somewhere. So it's not just this year. This year you named them all. But it's also next year. We'll have, of course, the next G20 summit in Rio, which we have to see in a way of continuity with what will be achieved in Delhi in September. We will also have the Summit for the Future organized by the UN. And even up to 2025, where we'll have the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, where we'll kind of find, hopefully, the successor of the Addis Action Agenda. So we're, let's say, in crucial years. There's a lot of ideas being floated around, including by the UN, very worthy ideas, but not just by the UN. We had a recent proposal by the African Development Bank on SDRs. We have many ideas that are being discussed. Of course, we also have to see what can be done and what cannot be done, especially in the short term. And this, you also named it, there's this summit in Paris taking place actually next week. This will be already a first step to prune the tree. So in view of the numerous initiatives that we are discussing, to already set the agenda and see what can be done, at least in the short term, and what needs to wait or what can be more difficult to achieve. I would expect concrete commitments, I would say, in the Paris summit. Maybe, I hope it will not be underwhelming, but something will be coming out of it. At least, again, some clarity on the steps forward that we can take. Now, on the not so good news, I would say that also Christopher referred to it. We're not facing the best macroeconomic, but mostly not the best geopolitical context for substantial agreements. And this goes beyond, of course, the Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is very important in that regard, but it goes way beyond that. It's linked to what we heard yesterday in the inaugural panel on this old wall that is struggling to keep its validity and the new wall that is still struggling to be born. And it's all about, I would say, competition between major powers. I will not name them, but I think we all have them in mind. And of course, this also has a big impact in terms of how we want to achieve things and how we can achieve them. Because in my view, of course, I mean, I understand that the global north, as Christopher was also saying, has to do more, has to step up in climate financing and other sorts of financing, of course. But I think it's also important to be clear about things and to expand the donor base. Just because the world today is not like the world in 1944, of course, and also not like the world in the 1990s. And for instance, when it comes to climate, when we're talking about climate financing, we're still based on a list of countries that was drawn up in 1992. And I think the world has changed, and that implies, I would say, that some members of the Global South that are in a better position right now than they were, much better position than they were in 1992, should also step up and maybe also contribute to achieving the goals that we have in mind.
Thank you. So bringing it a little bit more to the banking side of things, to Edward, who is our resident member of the European Investment Bank. Can you talk to us a little bit about multinational development banks and international financial institutions? Are they responsive enough, and how can they be made more responsive to these emerging challenges within green finance and development finance requirements?
Thanks, Rachel. Well, it's not an easy question, but I'll
You're
try.
the best person to answer it.
I mean, I do agree that MDBs and IFIs should be at the forefront of green finance. But I think that the problems we have ahead of us are so large, and the amount of money that are necessary to have a chance to be successful, we would definitely have to think about how to engage the private sector at scale into climate finance. Let me get back to that in a minute. Let me say a few words about what we've done in the past. And when I say we, it's the European Investment Bank, but I think many of our colleague IFIs and MDBs have been doing the same. I mean, we've been financing climate projects for decades. We launched the first green bond in the world back in 2007, the Climate Awareness Bond, the proceeds of which bond went into projects which had a positive environmental impact. Later on, we set ourselves what we thought was ambitious targets of reaching at least 50% of our financing going towards climate finance by 2025. But last year, we already reached 58%. Of course, we don't stop there. We will continue. I think it just shows that we are doing things. We're on the right track, but a lot more needs to be done. Now, during all these years of financing climate projects, we've built up quite a lot of in-house expertise. We have a large team of sector specialists, very experienced in financing green projects. And our team, our sector specialists, our advisory services, we engage with the public authorities, with corporates, NGOs, think tanks, to help share our knowledge, our expertise, to hopefully make green projects more successfully financially. Because now let me get back to the private sector. I mean, I think to get the private sector involved, what we need to do first and foremost is to de-risk green finance. The private sector is worried, as probably they should be, to at least make a financial return on those projects. And I think by us engaging more with the private sector, by de-risking projects, and how can we de-risk projects? We can de-risk them by having more technical assistance, having more grants, having concessional finance that will help the design and implementation of these projects to be more successful, and that also, in case if things do go south, that the private sector is shielded somewhat from the worst financial outcome. The second step we should build more capacity. Many countries around the world, many public authorities do not have the skills in-house, or not sufficient skills in-house, to successfully design and implement green projects. So this is again where we with our team can help, and our colleague MDBs and IFIs can do the same. And finally, and I'll stop then, we should be more local. MDBs have been doing business from abroad. We have now, as the EIB, we've set up 9 offices in Africa. The team in Nairobi is quite big. We have in-house sector experts and specialists. To go local means engaging more with the local governments, being more aware of their desires, their needs, but also if things go off track, to be able to respond quicker and hopefully get the projects back on track. I think if we focus on these things, and we should as MDBs and IFIs, I think that will hopefully enable the private sector to get more comfortable to invest in green projects, and hopefully that would lead to them coming into the sector at scale. And this is what we need to have any chance of fighting the climate crisis. Is that a sign I should shut up?
No, it was like really good point. Played rock music. No, thank you. I appreciate that. Valentina, coming over to you, let's talk a little bit about overseas development assistance. It seems like the donor-donee relationship has been and continues to face headwinds. Would you agree with that, first of all? And if so, why do those headwinds exist? And how do you think lenders can best respond and overcome them?
Yes, so at the OECD, we gather data on overseas development assistance, which is essentially public money that every year flows from developed countries' national budgets to developing countries. And to give a sense of volume, I think last year was about 200 billion overseas development assistance being provided to developing countries. And actually, it was an all-time high, 14% increase from the year before, so quite on a positive trend. We have to note that actually most of the increase was driven by humanitarian crisis and all the in-donor refugee costs that the donors face. And it's I agree on the fact that the donor-donee relationship is challenging because the donors have agreed on a target to provide 0.7% of their GNI to developing countries, and only about 5 or 6 of them last year did so. So the share is really quite low. So there's definitely historical and, as we said before, power or interest-driven considerations that really still shape this relationship quite a bit. But going beyond this, if we even look at the percentage of this development assistance that is climate-aligned, that's not even a third. So it's really good that many institutions now are setting targets to get 50% of their financing to target climate objectives, but we're still really behind on aligning development assistance with climate objectives. On a bit of a pessimistic note, I mean, ODA budgets, as we've seen, they're really thin. We're not gonna, as Chris mentioned before, we're not gonna solve these issues just with ODA money. And they're really competing priorities. Sometimes I hear organizations say, oh, that donor asks me to focus on climate, that donor asks me to focus on gender, that other donor asks me to focus on digital. And there is really this sense on competition across different priorities that I think really can be brought together in a much more integrated way and really thinking more holistically about these issues and not separately, because we know that the climate emergencies is also a gender issue and vice versa. So this is one aspect that I think shall be considered. And then, as we just heard, what donors can really do to help is to really mobilize more financing at scale. So to use these scarce resources that they do have to mobilize more money from private investors. And we also have data on private finance mobilized by ODA, which is really a tiny fraction of all the public finance that is being deployed. But I think last year and this year, we are really at a crucial moment, and a lot of momentum has been built to try and solve these issues. And the MDBs, I think, really play a key role in this. And we've seen last year with the Bridgetown Initiative, Barbados, but also with the G20 commissioning an independent review of the MDB's capital adequacy frameworks, there really is a focus now on donors as shareholders of these institutions to try and redefine what they can do to mobilize more, to redefine the risk capital and not consider these investments as only risky investments that need to be de-risked, but also to kind of share these risks and get more money flowing. So I think I'm hopeful that something will actually change thanks to all these different political processes happening at G20 level and at other levels. And I think that this could be a way to have more financing at scale for green investment.
It's interesting. So it seems like the importance of private financing and also de-risking, it's a common theme between the both of you. And I want to come back to that. But I want to zoom out a little bit again and come back to you, Chris, and touch on something that as someone who works in Washington, I always say if there is one thing that unites the Republican and Democratic parties right now in terms of foreign policy, it's Chinese hawkishness. It is, which I have my own thoughts on that. We could do a whole other panel on it. But it plays out in ways that I think can be really detrimental for progress in many different sectors. So I want to know, do you see the US-China competition playing out in terms of green finance and this broader fight against climate change? And if so, how? And is it detrimental?
Yes, it is playing out, and I would say it's broadly very detrimental. That's certainly the perspective from here on the African continent, but broadly in the global south, because essentially, as you've referred to in DC, there's this consensus that China is the new threat that must be focused on, and it must be that's the central geopolitical issue of the times, and that thinking permeates everything, including theoretically issues that are de-linked to that competition, but in the minds of Washington policymakers, lawmakers, administration officials, and eventually other institutions like multilateral development banks and the World Bank, which the US is the single largest shareholder, all of these things very subtly, but sometimes very openly. You think of a situation where the now former World Bank president appeared to be a climate denier. All of these things certainly say to government in the global south, are our priorities going to be, will they be put on the table when it comes to international forums? Now the World Bank is talking about a shift in its priorities toward climate change, which in theory sounds like a good thing, but many developing countries see that through that prism of competition with China, especially because, the US and many other Western governments argue that China is also a contributor to carbon emissions, and it should do more to combat its own emissions and contribute more to climate financing and all of these issues. So inevitably, that creates a stalemate where competition is driving activity rather than collaboration, because and this is something I've certainly heard from many African governments, that there are areas that they believe China and the United States can collaborate in their countries multilaterally and in the international system more broadly. But because the central issue of our times is competition, it clouds what should be a collaborative effort where, the United States and China, recognizing that, of course, they have their differences, but there are mutual interests, they have mutual priorities on a range of climate issues. They are unable to get there because the well has been poisoned so much. And of course, for countries that are seeking financing, and you have these two powers that dominate proceedings in international, as well as their own bilateral engagements, they think that puts them at a risk for accelerating funding for their own priorities and the things that they need. So if many of these countries, I'd say the vast majority of them, had their way, they'd probably just, put those two countries in a room, like, sort yourselves out, then come back out, then we can talk.
I wish we could do that too. It would be great. Before we turn to audience questions, and please start getting your questions ready. We want to leave about 10 minutes at the end to make sure the audience is involved. So start thinking of those. And I think that there are microphones on each aisle here that you can walk up to and ask your question on. So start thinking of that. Francesca, I want to turn it to you and bring in the EU to this conversation a little bit. Just talk to us a little bit about the role of the EU in some of the topics we've been talking about. Has it done enough? Is it doing enough? Should it be doing more? What are your general thoughts on the role of the European Union in this broader conversation about green finance? And if anyone else wants to hop in on this too, please feel free.
Very quickly, I mean, I think we can all do more. It can always be better, but I think the EU has been leader in showing the way forward in terms of decarbonizing economies and the path we have to follow with a view to 2050 or nearby to be carbon neutral and greenhouse gas emission neutral. So, of course, it could do more. I can quickly think about two items here. First, we need to actually set our own house in order. I mean, the ambitious package that we've been negotiating the last few years, the Fit for 55, we did a lot of progress. We agreed on extending the carbon market, the emissions trading system to other sectors. We agreed on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which I know is controversial, but for us it's very useful to avoid carbon leakage. But we still have some pieces of legislation that are not yet agreed because of course, differences in views between member states. Some of them have been agreed, but also created some rifts there. So I think the first thing would be to put our house in order, and I hope that the Spanish presidency of the Council next semester will help to that. Mm-hmm. And the second point would be, of course, when it comes to climate finance, also a bit linked to what I said at the end of the first question, to push for more being done, not just by Europeans, but also from others, from also other countries in the global north, but also some in the global south. And also, of course, for instance, last year, I think the EU had a crucial role in agreeing to the loss and damage fund, to this creation. But the approach was also that it should be more for more. So it should also be linked to more ambitious commitments when it comes to mitigation. So I think it's also a message that we have to send. We have to be ready to do more and to, of course, maybe put more money on the table and for real. But we also need to do it in a way that others can also respond, and also respond in a more positive fashion, also doing more within their capacities.
Thank you. Before we turn it to the audience, I'd like to turn to Edward and Valentina to either respond to that or tell us what we've missed. What else should we be discussing up here?
Let me first chip in on what Francesca said. I think, yes, we should do more. We should all do more. But I think we have to be realistic, given the COVID crisis, given the Russian invasion of Ukraine. All government budgets are stretched in Europe, in Africa. I mean, I think to expect more from governments, well, I hope so, but let's be realistic. It's probably not going to happen. I think the private sector is in much better shape. And that's, maybe I come back to what I said earlier. There's a lot more money there, and the private sector is always looking for investable projects. So we have to convince them that going into climate projects is actually a good investment. So I would say, we have to continue looking and activating and engaging the private sector more. And maybe on your second question, and I'll pass on. I mean, what have we missed? I think being active in development finance and private finance, there is a lot of fragmentation. There is and I think the theme also of the panel, of course, is we should collaborate more. And we collaborate a lot with Team Europe colleagues. We collaborate a lot with African Development Bank, World Bank, IFC, JICA, I mean, just to name a few. But I think also there we can, all of us, improve. And maybe, instead of focusing on the differences, which I've heard a lot on these panels the last day, we should maybe more focus on what we jointly want to achieve.
Yeah, first of all, fully agree on the fragmentation challenge. I think the climate finance architecture generally is way too fragmented, and a lot more collaboration is really needed. But another thing that I wanted to mention is that we've been actually discussing on green finance for decades, and having also discussions on what green really is for, I think, as much time. Yet we haven't really reached, a common definition or a common measurement methodology to actually collectively define what green really is. So sometimes we're not even speaking about the same things. And it goes to also the competition discussion we were having before. Different countries can have different views on what green is, on what mitigation is, or what adaptation is. And if we can agree that obviously renewable energy investment is green, if you go into the details, there's really a lot of discrepancies on that. So obviously we shouldn't get into these definitional and measurement issues as a, as a way of saying, okay, I can't define it, so I can't do anything about it, because we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. But I think really further efforts are needed to come together and continue these conversations on what's green, what's transition in the details.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I'd like to go ahead and turn it to our audience. I don't see any hands right now, but I know that there are questions. And so if I give it a couple seconds, I'm sure someone will be brave enough to raise their hands, or I'll cold call you. Just kidding, I won't actually do that. Sir, go ahead.
Good afternoon. Many countries are at the limit of the external debt. How can this country use these new resources or have access to this resource without an explosion of the external debt?
External debt?
Many developing countries are at the limit of their external debt. How these countries can use resources or have access of new resources without an explosion of this debt?
Who would like to touch on that? Is there any? Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
I'd like to think that I got the question, but if I didn't, please redirect me. I think for many developing countries, that's, as I mentioned earlier, they look at the existing fossil fuels, but also certainly here on the African continent, many of the countries are crucial to the transition to a green world. A lot of the resources that will be useful to the transition, whether it's electric vehicles or other forms of energy production, they look at what they have, they look at their strategic assets, they look at these resources as strategic assets. And they, but certainly the more fossil fuel producers, like Nigeria, Angola, they also know that there's still demand for their resources, for their oil and natural gas resources that they want to develop more. And as your question alluded to, they have debt problems that aren't going away anytime soon. So this is part of the controversy of the just transition debates, that yes, it's useful for us to transit to a new energy world, but in the meantime, how do we pay our debt? How do we run our economies? How do we boost our government coffers? As we've talked about, COVID, the Ukraine war, and all of these macro issues have devastated and increased the need to borrow, actually, because their economies aren't growing. But at the same time, many of these countries have climate and other emergencies that, are not going to go away anytime soon and actually worsening. Many countries have cities that are sinking further below sea level, and all of the many coastal West African cities, this is the rainy season, will be blighted by rainfall, for instance, Lagos, Accra, Abidjan. But, many of these countries also have many of these fossil fuels and other resources that, the world is telling them to ditch. So that's the difficulty in the debate.
Do you want to touch on that?
In terms of accessing international finance, that's a very tricky question. So Christopher was touching upon it. I think there's options on the table. We're discussing them. For instance, there's the possibility of expanding debt for climate swaps, so that this is basically a way to secure investments in climate positive actions without incurring a new debt. But it also requires that the lender agrees to a haircut, or basically to giving up on getting paid the debt back. There's also, of course, concessional financing, but it also has to be repaid. And another way, I would say, we have to explore, and it's not easy, but there's options on the table to explore the ways to increase the fiscal space of developing countries in a sustainable way. It involves, as Christopher was saying, also ensuring that they can have more own resources. but also that I would say the international financial system is set up in a way that is not so, I would say, difficult for them to access capital with a reasonable cost. I mean, again, I don't really have the solutions, but I can tell you there's willingness, I would say, to explore options to make this happen, and hopefully we'll see some progress in the coming years.
We have one more question here.
Thank you to all the panelists and the moderator for a very interesting discussion. I would like to hear from the panelists, do you consider there's a danger in separating climate finance from the overall development agenda? We know that the environment and climate in particular is very much a part of the Sustainable Development Goals. And if we treat them as something different, is there a danger of emptying the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda even more than it already has been emptied? Also because, as we know, these SDGs are also very closely intertwined, interrelated. So is it fruitful to think of climate as something separate from the overall agenda?
Thank you.
Thank you.
I might first turn to Valentina or Edward to see if you'd like to address that. Okay, Valentina.
Yes, I totally agree. I think sometimes we do separate these issues quite a bit, and there's really a lot of evidence showing that climate and development, they really go together. And to really reach sustainable development, you need to go on a low emission and resilient pathway, also economically speaking, and vice versa. So obviously, we can't be an expert on everything, and we do need the sector-specific expertise on climate, so that's really needed. But I think there really needs to be a conversation to bring these two together, and all the different SDGs, they're not separate, they're all interlinked. And the point that I was making earlier, that sometimes we perceive a competition before even mitigation and adaptation, we really need to think more about how a mitigation project can also have adaptation impact and vice versa. And I think it also relates to the point that emerged, I think, earlier regarding the different separations in a government across ministries. Sometimes you have the environment or the climate ministry, which is not necessarily so well linked or contributing to, the finance discussions or other types of sectoral discussions taking place. So I think that there needs to really be more efforts to bring these different agendas together.
Thank you. Annette, you have a question?
Yes, Anit Mukherjee, Senior Fellow at ORF America. Taking off from what Andre and Jose were saying, I also wrote down a quote that private sector is in a much better shape. Investing in climate projects is good for business. So why aren't they doing that? Is that something that there is a asymmetry, information asymmetry, a moral hazard? What are the problems? That's a core question, because there's a lot of discussion in the World Bank spring meetings this time on de-risking and blended finance, but some of my former colleagues at Center for Global Development showed that that's not going to happen. More finance will obviously have higher cost. So are the donors and the other communities willing to bear that cost? And to Andre and Jose's point, because countries don't have that fiscal space. Last, one quick question to the panel, but would you consider, take the case of Nigeria, which has very inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Would you consider, the donors consider doing a cash transfer program to increase the price of fossil fuels in Nigeria to reduce demand, green finance investment?
Thank you. Edward, would you want to touch on the first question?
The first question, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Well, it's a new sector, and the private sector is always hesitant to step into the unknown. And we're talking here about green finance in the developing world. That's another additional barrier for the private sector to go into, because it also entails more risk. And that's why I try to say that what we need to do is de-risk the perception of green finance in the developing world by, as I said, try to make either buffer the private sector from let's say, the worst potential outcomes of a certain project, concessional finance, grant money, but also by technical assistance, by designing and implementing the projects better. And once there's a track record of successful green projects, hopefully that will convince the private sector to engage more.
Thank you. Chris, I'm going to give final thoughts to you because we have about 20 seconds left, but you have more than that if you want.
Okay, sure. I'll respond to the question of Nigeria's fuel subsidies. And, there's a new government, the new president was sworn in about 2 weeks ago, and, the new administration has demonstrated some willingness to consider a range of, not just the fuel subsidies, which has now been eliminated, but also, Nigeria has a fairly broad green agenda, its contribution to the national, the NDCs from a couple of years ago was fairly, robust, but as the then government pointed out, they need a lot of money to fund these things. And, cash transfers, in Nigeria have a very dubious reputation because people just feel they're inefficient, they're, far from transparent, and they go up very often to the highest bidder in terms of people in government and, political elites sort of crowd out the broad population. So the new government, as I said, is open to the idea, but when you look at the political economy of previous cash transfers in other social investment programs, including some from the previous administration, it's not looking very good. So we'll see, I guess.
That was a positive note to end the panel on. Thank you to all of you. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful discussion.